The rain had been pouring relentlessly for hours, creating a steady rhythm against the roof of my car as I navigated the narrow, winding country roads. I wasn't sure why I had taken this route. Perhaps it was the desire for solitude, or maybe I just wanted to escape the constant noise of the city. After a particularly stressful week, the thought of getting lost in the countryside had seemed appealing. But now, with the storm intensifying and visibility reduced to almost nothing, I was starting to regret it. The road ahead was barely visible through the sheets of rain. My windshield wipers struggled to keep up, and my headlights cut only weak beams through the heavy downpour. The twisting path seemed endless, each curve of the road more treacherous than the last. The map on my phone had long stopped functioning after I lost service an hour ago. I had no idea where I was or how far I was from the nearest town. I was on edge, gripping the steering wheel tightly, trying to stay calm, but when the wind picked up and rattled my car, I knew I had to stop for the night. It was too dangerous to keep going, and the fatigue from driving for hours was starting to catch up with me. That's when I saw the sign through the mist and rain. Old Mill Motel vacancy. The flickering neon sign stood out like a beacon in the storm. The motel itself looked like something from another time, a long, single-story building with a row of doors, paint chipped and faded from years of neglect. The whole place gave off a sense of abandonment, but it seemed like my only option. I pulled into the gravel lot, the crunch of the tires barely audible over the storm. The lot was mostly empty, except for a couple of old, rusted cars that looked like they hadn't moved in years. I grabbed my bag from the back seat, shielding myself from the rain as best as I could, and headed for the office. The rain soaked through my jacket in seconds, and the coldness bit at my skin. The door to the office creaked loudly as I pushed it open. A bell above the door jingled, though the sound felt strangely out of place in the damp, musty room. The air was thick with the smell of mildew. An old man sat behind the counter, hunched over with thick glasses perched on the end of his nose. He didn't look up as I entered, his gnarled fingers methodically flipping through a yellowed ledger. "Need a room," he muttered, his voice low and gravelly, without bothering to glance my way. "Yeah, of course," I replied, though I immediately questioned my decision. The place felt wrong somehow. He pushed an old-fashioned key across the counter, a cold silence hanging in the air. "Room 15, he said, gruffly, without lifting his head. He didn't offer any pleasantries or further conversation, just a key and a number. I took the key, mumbled a quick thanks, and left the office. The eerie quiet of the place pressed in around me as I made my way to room 15. The rain had let up slightly, but the wind was howling, sending chills through me that had nothing to do with the temperature. Something about this place made my skin crawl. When I reached room 15, the door creaked loudly as I unlocked it and stepped inside. The room was exactly as I'd feared, dimly lit, with faded wallpaper peeling at the edges, a sagging bed that had seen far better days, and a musty odor that clung to everything. The lamp on the nightstand flickered weakly, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. I dropped my bag onto the floor and collapsed onto the bed, exhausted. The springs creaked under my weight, the sound echoing in the silence of the room. I stared up at the ceiling, trying to shake the unease that had settled over me. Despite my exhaustion, sleep didn't come easily. Something about the room felt off, like I wasn't alone. And I tried to tell myself I was just overtired, that my mind was playing tricks on me, but the sensation of being watched was growing stronger. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and I closed my eyes, trying to focus on the storm. But then I heard a soft, rhythmic tapping. At first I thought it was the wind or the rain, but this was different. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside the room. I opened my eyes, my heart pounding in my chest. The tapping was faint but deliberate, echoing from the far side of the room. Slowly sat up, canning the dim space. The tapping continued, steady and insistent, drawing my attention to the closet door. My pulse quickened as I realized it was coming from inside. For a moment I debated ignoring it, pretending I hadn't heard anything. Maybe it was just an old pipe or the wind playing tricks on me, but the tapping persisted, louder now, almost as if it was trying to get my attention. I stood up, my legs shaky as I approached the closet. My hand hovered over the doorknob. Part of me wanted to open it, to prove to myself that there was nothing there. But another part of me, the part that was drenched in cold fear, wanted to run. With a deep breath, I turned the knob and pulled the door open. The closet was empty. Just a few old wire hangers swaying gently as if disturbed by a breeze that shouldn't exist. I let out a shaky laugh, feeling foolish. Of course there was nothing there. This place was just old and creepy, and I was letting my imagination get the best of me. I shut the closet door and returned to the bed, but the unease lingered. My heart was still racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The wind howled louder outside, but the tapping inside the room stopped until it resumed, louder than before. This time it was more insistent, almost frantic. I sat up again, my pulse pounding in my ears. The tapping was at random. It was deliberate, like someone or something was trying to communicate. My mouth went dry as I listened closely, and then just beneath the tapping I heard it a whisper, faint and unintelligible but unmistakable. It was coming from the closet. I froze, my body paralyzed by fear. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The whisper grew louder, still incomprehensible but filled with a sense of urgency. The tapping quickened and sank with the whispered words that clawed at my sanity. I bolted up from the bed, grabbing my bag in a panic. I had to get out of that room. I rushed to the door and threw it open, stumbling outside into the storm. Well, the rain pounded down on me, but the wind felt like a relief compared to the oppressive air in room 15. I ran to the office, hoping to find the old man, hoping for some kind of explanation. But when I reached the door, it was locked. I banged on it, calling out for him, but the place was dark and empty. It was as if no one had been there at all. Frantic, I ran back to my car, but just as I reached it, I glanced back at room 15. Through the window, I saw something, a faint light flickering inside. I hadn't left any lights on. My blood ran cold. I crept closer, peering through the window. The room looked empty, exactly as I had left it, except for one thing. The closet door was slightly ajar, and inside, barely visible in the shadows, stood a figure. It was tall and gaunt, its long, thin fingers wrapped around the edge of the door. Its face was obscured in darkness, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. The tapping resumed, louder than ever, echoing through the walls. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't human. I turned and sprinted to my car, fumbling with the keys as my hands shook uncontrollably. Finally, I managed to start the engine, and as I sped out of the lot, I glanced in the rearview mirror, where the figure stood in the window, watching me as I drove away. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away from the Crestwood Motel. I didn't care how tired I was or how bad the storm got. I wasn't spending another second near that place. Whatever was in that closet, whatever was tapping or whispering, was something far beyond my understanding. I never reported the incident. Who would believe me? But sometimes late at night, when I'm lying in bed, I still hear that tapping. Slow, deliberate, like it's waiting for me to open the door, waiting for me to let it out. It was a quiet, unassuming motel nestled on the edge of a forgotten town, the kind of place you drive past without a second thought, except when your car breaks down in the middle of nowhere. That's exactly what happened to me one rainy evening. The storm had swept in suddenly, and my car, struggling against the torrents of rain, had sputtered to a halt, just as I saw the flickering neon sign of the Crestwood Motel. I pulled into the gravel lot, tires splashing through puddles as I made my way to the office. The place looked like it hadn't seen a guest in years. The paint was peeling, and the sign was half burnt out. Inside, the air was stale, filled with the musty smell of mold and old cigarette smoke. An elderly man sat behind the counter, his eyes hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. He looked up with a piercing gaze that seemed to see right through me. "Room," he rasped, his voice a thin, hollow whisper. "Yes, just for the night," I replied, shivering from the cold and damp. He handed me a key with a rusty tag labeled 9 and nodded toward a door at the far end of the hallway. I took the key and trudged down the dimly lit corridor. The light flickered intermittently, casting eerie shadows that danced on the walls. The room itself was as decrepit as the rest of the place, faded wallpaper, a threadbare carpet, and a bed that looked like it had seen better days. I tried to shake off my unease, telling myself I was just tired and that the storm outside was making everything seem worse. I lay down, hoping sleep would come quickly, but the storm outside wasn't the only thing keeping me awake. Strange noises started, soft thumps, rustling, and an occasional creak of the floorboards. Then, just as I was beginning to doze off, there was a knock at the door. I sat up, puzzled. Who'd be knocking at this hour, especially in such a rundown place? I peered through the peephole but saw nothing but darkness. I hesitated, then opened the door a crack. No one was there. I shrugged it off, but the sense of unease persisted. I settled back into bed, trying to ignore the noises, when I heard another knock, louder this time. With a sigh, I got up and opened the door fully. This time there were two people standing there, an older woman and a younger man, both dressed in what looked like vintage clothes from the 1950s. "Can we come in?" the woman asked, her voice soft and polite but with an underlying tension. I was taken aback. "I'm sorry, I don't understand. This is my room." The man glanced over his shoulder and then back at me, his eyes dark and hollow. "We're just looking for a place to rest. We've been traveling for a long time." There was something unsettling about them, their demeanor too calm, their eyes too vacant. "I don't think it's a good idea," I said, trying to close the door. Before I could, the woman placed a hand on the door frame, her touch cold as ice. "Please, just for a moment. We don't want to trouble you." Against my better judgment, I let them in, hoping it would be a quick visit. They entered the room with a grace that belied their age. As they settled into the chairs, I noticed their clothing was immaculate, almost too perfect for the dilapidated surroundings. The room seemed to grow colder as they took their seats, and I could see my breath forming tiny clouds in the air. "We've been on the road for so long," the woman said, her eyes fixed on the floor. "Sometimes we just need a place to rest." The man nodded in agreement, but there was something off about his smile. It didn't reach his eyes. They spoke in whispers, their conversation a murmur of disjointed phrases that didn't quite make sense. I felt a growing sense of dread, as if I was being drawn into something far beyond my understanding. Suddenly the power went out. The room was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from occasional flashes of lightning outside. I could hear their breathing slow and rhythmic, and the soft rustle of what sounded like old, crinkled paper. My heart raced as I fumbled for my flashlight, but when I turned it on, the room was empty. The chairs were vacant, and there was no sign of the strange guests. I searched the room frantically, but they were gone. The air was still cold, and the unsettling silence was deafening. I glanced at the door, but it was locked from the inside. I unlocked it and hurried out into the hallway, my flashlight casting eerie shadows along the walls. The corridor was empty, and the rain had stopped. I approached the office, hoping the old man could explain what had happened, but the office was locked. I pounded on the door, but there was no answer. I never saw those strange guests again, and I left the Crestwood Motel as quickly as I could. The next morning, when the rain had cleared, I drove away, never looking back. I later learned that the motel had been closed for years and was rumored to be haunted, a place where time and reality twisted together, drawing in lost souls. To this day, I still wonder about the strange guests, their cold touch, and their vacant eyes. Were they real, or was it all just a nightmare? I can't be sure, but every now and then when the storm clouds gather and the rain starts to fall, I remember that night and the silent terror that lingered long after I left the Crestwood Motel.